The Angels of Mons were a reflection of our deepest fears and desires, a myth born of the trenches and the desperate need for something to believe in. Arthur Machen, Welsh author and journalist. Hi there and welcome to No Past, No Future, where we will be taking a journey through the most interesting and pivotal events of World War I in a somewhat sequential order. For this episode, I want to talk about the mythical story of the Angels of Mons. But for the telling of the story, we must first set the stage for what it was that would bring about such a tale. Now, if you've done any reading on the First World War, you would have no doubt heard of the famed Schlieffen Plan. This plan was the brainchild of an Alfred von Schlieffen, who was a German field marshal and strategist and served as the chief of the Imperial German staff from 1891 to 1906. This plan of his had been in the works for quite some time, and to cut a long story short, this plan was to thrust a huge force of around 700,000 men through Belgium to flank down on top of Paris, take it, and knock the French out of the war as quickly as possible. Now, speed was key, and this was to avoid a two-front war at the same time with France's ally of Russia, who was on the Germans' rear. If all went to plan, they could knock the French out quickly and turn their attention to the giant colossus of Russia and be ready to fight them before the supposedly sluggish empire had even mobilized. But right from the get-go, things didn't quite go to plan. This was because in order to execute this plan, they had to go through Belgium to get to Paris. Now, Helmut von Moltke, who was in charge of executing the Schlieffen Plan, was hoping that the Belgians would just step aside and let the German army through. I mean, what could they do against such overwhelming odds anyway? But the Belgians showed defiance and great courage. Belgium's King Albert I said this to von Moltke. "One single vision fills all minds, that of our independence endangered. One single duty imposes itself upon our wills, the duty of stubborn resistance. In these solemn circumstances, two virtues are indispensable, a calm but unshaken courage and the close union of all Belgians." Well, the Belgians had a lot more pluck than von Moltke was expecting. And this enraged von Moltke because the whole plan was based around speed, and any halting operations would give the French and the Russians valuable time to prepare. So what happened next would become known as the Rape of Belgium. The German conduct here would become well known and would start a long campaign by the Allied media sources to sully the German army's honour. You can make a case that even to this day, the Germans have not lived down the reputation that they earned from both world wars, because of their brutal treatment that they meted out to civilians and non-combatants. Now, back in 1839 at the Treaty of London, the Belgians were guaranteed their independence, and this violation by the Germans has now brought the British Empire into the war, which has added further stress to von Moltke. And remember, Britain wasn't just her mainland, it included all her dominions too, like the Anzacs from down under, the South Africans, India, the Canadians, and that added a hell of a lot of manpower to the equation for the Germans. So already for von Moltke, things are going from bad to worse. And to add a little salt to the wound, the Russians are already mobilized and starting to head into East Prussia. The old nerves of von Moltke must surely be feeling a little frayed. But he does have a magnificent army under his command and is about to put it to the test against the French now that he has smashed the Belgians. The French general in the crosshairs is a Charles Lanrezac. Lanrezac knew a few months ago that there was going to be a huge force heading his way and has been requesting reinforcements. He was frustrated by the reluctance of his superior General Joseph Joffre to take the threat seriously, as Joffre was initially preoccupied by the French attacks in Alsace and Lorraine and the botched offensive in the Ardennes. Lanrezac was in charge of the 5th Army and was right out on the French left flank closest to the English Channel. And this is where the Brits come in. The British first started arriving on French soil around the 7th of August, but a lot more arrive on the 11th and the 12th. They are saying to the French that they're not going to be ready to fight until the 26th of August. The BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, gets to France with 70,000 men, which is 5 divisions, 4 of them infantry and 1 cavalry. Just to give you perspective, the Germans are deploying 85 divisions on the Western Front, roughly 1.3 million men. At this time, the British Army is a small army of professionals. They were more of a sea power at this time, and they had deployed a large portion of their army onto French soil against the wishes of many back home, because if they lost it, they would not have enough of an army back home to protect against a German invasion of their home soil. Now, British Field Marshal Lord Horatio Kitchener said this to Sir John French, the commander who was taking the BEF over to France. Look, these 70,000 men are 90% of all we have. France and Germany, they have millions of men in the field. This is our army. Don't lose it. The BEF at this time might have well been the most experienced and well-trained on the field. They had many veterans of the recent Boer War in South Africa and veterans of the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan in 1898, where you would find some familiar names cut in their teeth. The likes of a Winston Churchill and Douglas Haig were at this Battle of Omdurman and would come to play huge roles later in the war, and obviously Churchill would become immortalised during World War II as well.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender!
Now, the French had been pressuring the British since the beginning of the war, constantly urging them to move faster, move faster. We need support up here on our left flank, it's critical. In response, the British hurried into Belgium to secure the left flank and protect General Lanrezac's Fifth Army. But before they could even reach their position, the French were retreating in the opposite direction. Lanrezac was pulling back to stay aligned with the other French armies, leaving the British army flank dangerously exposed. A possible point of contention here for the British, one could imagine. So as they are moving into Belgium, they stumble into the Germans at a place called Mons, and they will take up defensive positions along the Mons-Condé Canal. The British are running into the tip of the German spear, commanded by an Alexander von Kluck. They only run into part of von Kluck's army, about 160,000 men, who are surprised to see the British there waiting for them, who are behind defensive positions and dug in along 25 miles of the canal. The British think they're going to be facing a corps of Germans, maybe two, and instead they are facing 4+ corps. A corps in the German army at this time was around 44,000 men. And as the Germans advanced in dense formations across open ground, they were met with devastating volleys from the British infantry. The British soldiers were highly skilled in rapid fire with their Lee Enfield rifles, which was often mistaken for machine gun fire due to its speed and accuracy. But at this time, there were only 2 Vickers machine guns per battalion, a battalion being between 600 and 1,000 men. What the Germans were experiencing was mass rifle fire from the well-trained Tommies. One German officer later remarked of the occasion, "We did not expect such fire. It was murderous, and it seemed as though every bullet found its mark." One British officer recalled of the scene, quote, "The Germans came on in masses, as though they were on parade. Our men simply couldn't miss. They fell in heaps, and still they came on. It was like scything down grass." The Brits were slaughtering waves of German advances, but there were so many of them pushing forward that they were getting across the canal on the flanks, and the Brits were forced to retreat. And what ensued from here would become known as the Great Retreat. They began retreating along with the French around 25 miles a day back toward Paris, with heavy packs on and under constant fire from the hotly pursuing Germans. This went on for days. The soldiers were out of water, out of rations, tired, fatigued, and pushed to the brink of human endurance. And then some of the soldiers started to see things. Now this is really where our story begins. With so much at stake here, the possibility of losing the majority of your nation's armed forces in one battle was at stake. Men were dropping from exhaustion and dying all around. Many started to hallucinate. And as I'm sure you and I would in this situation, they started to call on the divine for a miracle. Some men saw strange lights appear in the sky. Some men saw angels. Others saw the great figure of St. George on a horse. Others saw Bowmen from the Battle of Crécy. That battle took place not actually far from here in 1346 against the French. And these bowmen were shooting arrows into the German lines. Now let's take a quote from the Bowmen by Arthur Machen. "But the shells came on and burst and tore good Englishmen limb from limb, and tore brother from brother. And as the heat of that day increased, so did the fury of that terrific cannonade. There were no stouter hearts in the whole world than the hearts of these men. But even they were appalled at the 7 times heated howl of the German cannonade, which fell upon them, overwhelmed them, and destroyed them. And at this very moment, they saw from their trenches that a tremendous host was moving against their lines. 500 of our 1,000 remained, and as far as we could see, the German infantry was pressing on against us. Column upon column, a grey world of men, 10,000 of them as it appeared afterwards. There was no hope at all. The men shook hands and bid farewell in advance of their oncoming fate. One man improvised a new version of the battle song, Goodbye Tipperary, ending with, and we shall not get there. And all the while they went on firing steadily.
But we shall not get there.
Again quoting from Arthur Machen's The Bowmen. Hurrah, hurrah, St. George succour us, the lads shouted. A long bow and a strong bow. Heaven's knight aid us. And before them, beyond the trench, were a long line of shapes, with a shining about them. They were like men who drew the bow, and with another shout, their cloud of arrows flew slinging and tingling through the air toward the German hosts. The English could hear the guttural screams of the German officers, the crackle of their revolvers as they shot their reluctant. And still, line after line crashed to the earth. The singing arrows fled so swift and thick that they darkened the air. The heathen horde melted before them. In Germany, a country ruled by scientific principles, the great general staff decided that the contemptible English must have employed shells containing an unknown gas of a poisonous nature, as there were no wounds discernible on the bodies of the dead German soldiers. End quote. So what was going on here? What were these supernatural apparitions? Were the angels really on the side of the Brits? Or were these the projections of fatigued and hallucinating men? Atrocity reports like the rape of Belgium paved the way for a belief that the Christian God would intervene directly against such an evil enemy. Were the angels military intelligence to spread morale-boosting propaganda? I know for sure that if my country at this time still had a conscripted army like the Brits did, and not a drafted army, I would for sure be using all the ammunition of this sort I could to fill up my ranks with men ready to fight the good fight against an evil adversary. Whatever the truth of the matter is, we may never really know, so I will leave it in your capable hands for you to decide. Now, even though the Battle of Mons was technically a loss for the British, they showed everyone that they could punch well and truly above their weight class. And it is natural for us humans to use storytelling to make sense of things and to provide a narrative to rally behind, and in this case, turn a defeat into a victory of sorts. Similarly for the Anzacs down under, we still remember the loss at Gallipoli every year. It is a story that our nations rally behind, and where us Kiwis and Aussies carved out our national identities as stubborn and courageous fighters. The importance of storytelling in terms of its effectiveness cannot be overstated. So in closing, let us finish with one more quote from the wonderful story of Arthur Machen's The Bowmen. And so he wrote of English soldiers who were few against fearful odds, but as they sent the breech bolt home and aimed and fired, they became aware that others fought beside them. Down the air came cries to St. George and a twanging of the bowstring. The old bowmen of England had risen to England's need from their graves in that French earth and were fighting for England.
It's a long, long way to Tipperary.